Hello, everybody. Luke Schulte, Field Agronomist for Beck's Hybrids. One of the questions that we're getting very frequently, now that harvest is completed for most, is just where did these massive, in some cases, record-breaking yields come from? How do we take the learnings from 2023 and apply them to hopefully experience maybe even better or similar results for 2024? With that said, let's just dive into it.
So there are two primary reasons as to why we experienced the yields that we had this past year. And the first one is the fact that we just didn't get any big or oversaturating rains following planting. I think many of us would have to agree that that first rain we get following planting really kind of sets the stage for how those soils are going to behave and dictates how those soils are going to accept water throughout the growing season. The fact that we got very gentle rains, we didn't get any big rains, we went a long period of time without rain, just allowed our soils to maintain that structure, that aggregate stability, and ultimately led to higher oxygen levels throughout the growing season. Then the second reason is this whole notion around stress memory. I'd actually never heard of this up until one of our fellow agronomists brought this up about 6 months ago. And stress memory is just the plant's ability to alter its DNA based on past experience. In front of you, you can see a rainfall coverage map from June 12th. Whether you planted early or you planted late, we didn't have really a significant rain in many cases from the middle of May to the middle of June, and in some cases further into June even than that. And the fact that we had minimal to no rain for a month to 5, 6, 7 weeks, and the first rain we received as a whole was a fairly gentle or broad rain, just allowed our soils to maintain that aggregate stability, ultimately increasing that oxygen level. Oxygen is very important. When we think about germination and emergence, there's 3 requirements. And I think it's easy to kind of get focused on the requirement for moisture, and we want warm soil temperatures. But what I often find the most detrimental or inhibiting to successful even emergence is oxygen. Here's a case in point. This is a planting condition study from a couple years ago at London. We had 3 different entries, and the first one was planted on April 20th when we had pretty good soil temperatures, very good soil conditions and 65-degree soil temperatures, but they're predicting it to get cold that night. And in fact, it did. We got 3 inches of snow overnight. In fact, Jared had to clear the snow in order to learn what was the soil temperature at the seeding depth. It was about 40 degrees. Well, it warmed up that evening or that afternoon, and it melted the snow off, and the soil temperatures climbed about 10, 12 degrees. But it also snowed the very next morning on that entry. Got a skiff of snow, and the soil temperatures are actually even cooler yet. You can see sub 40 degrees. Well, planted about a week later, so the second entry is around April 27th. With 5-degree warmer soil temperatures, soil conditions were very good again. And then the last entry was on the 28th, so about 8 days after the first that had gotten snowed on. But here the soil temperatures are actually the warmest, but they're predicting rain that evening. And here's the result. This is my case in point why oxygen is actually more critical to germination and emergence than is temperature. Look at the overall yield results and the overall population difference. The poorest producing corn with the weakest stand was actually planted into the warmest soils, but closest to the rain event. That first entry on April 20th, which was the highest producing, had the best overall final stand that had gotten 3 inches of snowed on, was able to maintain that soil oxygen for a longer period of time. 3 inches of snow, as you know, doesn't materialize into a lot of water, didn't inundate the soil, and certainly was able to maintain that oxygen level. Oxygen is just important, in fact, probably more important, especially in our clay pan soils, to overall successful emergence and germination. How do we apply this in 24? Think about the hesitancy we oftentimes have when we have cooler than desired conditions. Are we better off to wait for warmer temperatures? Or are we better to plant perhaps if we have cooler temperatures, but we know we have soil oxygen? Remember, large rain events or more violent, wicked storms tend to brew up as our ambient temperatures increase because our air can just hold more water vapor, and that ultimately produces more wicked storms. Second reasoning is around the stress memory, okay? Stress memory is just the plant's ability to adapt, okay? It can store that stress information so that it can respond differently when it sees that same stress again. If you look in that second bullet point, I think that's pretty neat to see, and remarkable is the fact that they've proven that there were over 1,000 genes that were altered in order to account and respond differently when it sees that same stress later in the growing season. Think back to the growing season and how the stress memory might have played a role. Here's our July rainfall. We've already talked about how late May and June were very dry. July for many was pretty wet, anywhere from 4 to 8 inches. But the month of August for most was actually rather dry, especially if you consider the primary rain that came throughout the month of August was on August 24th. It was the Thursday of Becknology days. Most of our rain for the month came in a one single rain event. And then September was also very dry. So think about the growing season. If you planted early in the month of April, those corn and soybean acres experienced cool weather stress. They experienced dry in late May and June. They experienced wet on some acres, I should say, in July, dry again in August, wet on August 24th in some areas, and dry again in September. If you planted in the second half of May, they experienced all those same stresses with the exception of cool weather as a whole. They could alter their DNA and respond differently. When are we more likely to see a multitude of stresses? It's when we plant early. Last thing I want to talk about is nitrogen learnings. We've been studying nitrogen for a long period of time, as you well know, but we continue to learn. And this is from our system study at Ohio. I'm not going to walk through all the different treatments, but as you can see what I pointed out there by the red and the green circle, when we applied that 60 pounds of nitrogen with the planter as opposed to just weed and feed, we saw a 13 bushel advantage on soils that are well maintained from a drainage standpoint with minimal, if any, compaction. In a year when we had minimal soil moisture, having that placement close to the row, accessible nitrogen early, really played a vital role. Probably exacerbated by the fact that we didn't have a lot of soil moisture. We weren't super efficient with that weed and feed, getting that nitrogen in the plant in a timely manner. But this is one of our learnings that we want to move forward with, is the importance of early nitrogen to pollination. We know that rapid nitrogen uptake doesn't occur till about the 8th leaf stage, but these pictures, along with the yield data, really helps us to understand we can't ignore early nitrogen. In fact, early nitrogen, we believe, is actually helping with pollination, which doesn't occur for quite some time. As you can see on the right there, those ears are filled out clear to the tip. That had nitrogen applied pre-plant in the form of ammonia. On the left, wouldn't necessarily be my recommendation, but there was no nitrogen applied until V5, and look at the volume of tip back. So even though rapid nitrogen uptake doesn't occur till well into the season, we can't ignore that accessible, available, reachable early nitrogen prior to, say, like V4 is really critical to not only ear initiation, but overall pollination that isn't even going to occur for quite some time. So those are two of the biggest learnings that we had from the past growing season, or rationales as to why we had the tremendous yields. And I'd encourage you, don't just chalk it up that, I can't impact Mother Nature. I would challenge you, what do we learn from it, and how do we apply those learnings to our crop and management plans for 2024? As always, if you have questions, give us a call. Have a Merry Christmas.